wisdom,
prudentia,
justice,
justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
Welcome to the Sunday Stoic Podcast. This is Steve coming to you from Conway, Arkansas. This is a podcast where you can follow me, a follower of the philosophy of Stoicism, as I read, try to interpolate and understand the ancient writings of Stoicism and apply them to modern life. So I am by no means an expert. I'm not a PhD in philosophy. I am a regular guy trying to improve my life with some ancient wisdom. And as I've said in the past, ancient wisdom does not automatically make it worthwhile wisdom. But I have seen a lot of commonalities in Stoicism with other schools of thought from around the world. And I've seen it tie into a lot of modern science as well. And I think it is a useful system. There are other systems out there. This is not a religion where we claim this is the one true faith. And as we'll see in today's reading, we have two gentlemen talking. Today, what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a break from the normal format where I do a reading and then I come back and I talk about that reading. I think I'm going to interject my own comments while we're reading. And what I've done is I've just taken a few paragraphs from the beginning of the book, on the goods or on the ends of good and evil by Cicero, book 3. I'm not going to do the whole thing today. We'll do more later, but we're going to do the first part. And in this book, basically Cicero, who is not a Stoic, but he has some sympathies for Stoic thought, is talking to Cato, who is a Stoic. The famous Cato who opposed Julius Caesar and then committed suicide when Caesar won the day. Cato was a friend of Cicero. Now, this is probably not a transcript of a real conversation, but what it is a writing by Cicero where he uses Cato as the stereotypical Stoic, and he explains a lot of Stoic philosophy. Now, I'm going to pick and choose things to read here. It's not that long of a read, and you can find it for free online. I recommend you check it out yourself. But I am going to choose some pertinent points today, and we'll continue this discussion in future episodes. So, without further ado, let's hear from Cicero and Cato discussing philosophy. So we begin here with Cicero walking into a friend's library out in the country somewhere, and he walks in the room, and there is Cato, surrounded by a pile of books on Stoicism. Cato says, "But what, pray, are the books that you must come here for, when you have so large a library of your own?" And Cicero retorts, "I have come to fetch some notebooks from Aristotle, which I knew were here. I wanted to read them during my holiday. I do not often get any leisure." Cato then says, "How I wish that you had thrown in your lot with the Stoics. You of all men might have expected to reckon virtue as the only good." They go on to discuss a little bit about that, about virtue being the only good, and a few other things, and they decide that they're going to talk about philosophy, and they're going to start with Cato explaining the Stoic position. So this is a great way to hear a summary of Stoicism, probably not from Cato himself, but from someone who knew Cato and who was really familiar with the Stoics, someone who had access to the texts of Zeno and things that we no longer have today. So, Cato says, "My opinion." You ask what my opinion is? That those good, brave, just, and temperate men, of whom history tells us, or whom we have ourselves seen in our public life, who, under the guidance of nature herself, without the aid of any learning, did many glorious deeds, that these men were better educated by nature than they could possibly have been by philosophy had they accepted any other system other than the one that counts moral worth the only good and moral baseness as the only evil. All other philosophical systems have varying degrees, no doubt, but still, all which reckon anything but which virtue is not an element either as a good or an evil, do not merely, as I hold, give us no assistance or support towards becoming better men, but are actually corrupting to the character. All right, let's unpack that real quick. So they're talking about whether virtue is the only good. And by virtue, he's saying moral worth or moral baseness. So your internal character, your moral self, the things you do when no one's looking and the things you do when you're in public, and the acts you take and the choices you make. Those are where moral worth, or where good lies. The word good, you're not allowed to use much in Stoicism. Good only apply. Good is like it's a very serious term. Good is the good. Like in Christianity, it's like God, right? It's pure. It's pure good. Okay. They even capitalize it a lot. Okay. So the good is only applied to your moral worth. And evil is only applied to moral baseness. So not being moral. And what he's saying here is all the other philosophical systems, in some degree or another, often apply the word good to things outside of that internal structure, outside of moral goodness and moral baseness. For example, those that follow Aristotle, virtue is good, but also good looks and being of high birth and having some money and leisure time, and all these things are considered good. And they have a better chance of allowing you to achieve virtue. Or I should say, allowing you to achieve eudaimonia, which is the ultimate goal. Eudaimonia, if you don't know, being that happy life, or the well-lived life, the flourishing life, the good flow of life that we're all seeking. And it makes sense, right? Having some wealth and leisure time and being, sexy, not something I've ever had to worry about. But those things might make some things go easier for you, might lead to happiness. But the Stoics would argue those things don't always lead to happiness. Therefore, they are not a good. Okay? We're kind of going to get there, but that's the ultimate, argument here. These other philosophies that do not hold virtue as the only good, or, moral worth as the only good, not only don't assist you to become better, but they actually probably corrupt your character, because you start pursuing things that are outside of your control, as Epictetus would later go on to elaborate on in his works a while after this was written. So he says, either this point must be firmly maintained, that the moral worth is the sole good, or it is absolutely impossible to prove that virtue constitutes happiness. And in that case, I do not see why we should trouble to study philosophy. For if anyone who is wise could be miserable, why should I not set much value on your vaunted and belauded virtue? All right. Some of this writing is a mouthful. So what he's saying here is, why should I really care about virtue if it's not the only good? Why should I bother studying it if it's not the only key to happiness? I don't know. This might be a circular argument, right? But he's saying, I'm not going to spend any time pursuing virtue if there are other things that are good that are easier to get. Philosophy is hard work. And why would you do it if there were easier ways to get to the same end? What you have said so far, Cato, I answered, might equally well be said by the followers of Pyrrho or Aristo. These were philosophers who were more leaning towards the Cynic view that virtue, once again, was the only good and nothing else mattered. Everything else was an indifferent. And by indifferent, they meant had no bearing on moral worth, on happiness. They, as you are aware, think as you do, that this moral worth you speak of is not merely the chief, but the only good. And from this necessity follows the proposition that I notice you maintain, namely, that the wise are always happy. Do you then, I ask, commend these philosophers and think that we ought to adopt this view of theirs? I certainly would not have you adopt their view, he said, for it is of the essence of virtue to exercise choice among the things in accordance with nature, so that philosophers who make all things absolutely equal, rendering them indistinguishable either as better or worse, and leaving no room for selection among them, have abolished virtue itself. I will expound, unless you think it out of place, the whole system of Zeno and the Stoics. He began, "It is the view of those whose system I adopt, that immediately upon birth, for that is the proper point to start from, a living creature feels an attachment for itself, and an impulse to preserve itself and to feel affection for its own constitution and for those things which tend to preserve that constitution. While on the other hand, it conceives an antipathy to destruction and those things which appear to threaten destruction. In proof of this opinion, they urge that infants desire things conducive to their health and reject things that are opposed before they ever have felt pleasure or pain. This would not be the case unless they felt an affection for their own constitution and were afraid of destruction." So this is the origin of the Stoics' care for society. One cares for themselves, one cares then also for their children naturally, and then this can expand to all of society, uniting everyone into a kind of a mutual cosmopolis in which everyone looks out for one another. They go on to talk about cognition, and he says, again, acts of cognition, which we may term comprehensions or perceptions, or if these words are distasteful or obscure, he uses a Greek word here, which I won't even try to say. I'll try. Catalepsis or something like that. Anyway. These we consider to be adopted for their own sake because they possess an element, so to speak, that embraces and contains the truth. This can be seen in the case of children, whom we may observe to take pleasure in finding something out for themselves by the use of reason, even though they gain nothing by it. So we enjoy using reason to figure things out, using our minds, the spark of Zeus we've been given to figure out the world. He goes on to say, the sciences also, we consider, are things to be chosen for their own sake, partly because there is in them something worthy of choice, partly because they consist of acts of cognition and contain an element of fact established by methodical reasoning. The mental assent to what is false, as the Stoics believe, is more repugnant to us than all other things that are contrary to nature. So science is in accordance to nature. It's us understanding the world and learning as much as we can to avoid, as Epictetus would later discuss also in more detail, the assent to false opinions. We want to believe in as many true things as possible. And that's the only way we can live well. And we can't understand what's true unless we study logic and study the world in which we live. The next step is the following fundamental classification. That is, which is in itself accordance with nature, or which produces something else that is so, and which therefore is deserving of choice as possessing a certain amount of positive value, axia, as the Stoics call it. This they pronounce to be valuable. And on the other hand, that which is contrary to nature they term valueless. So what is he saying here? Well, there are things that are in accordance to nature, that lead to something that is in accordance to nature and involve choice. And therefore, while they are not in themselves your moral worth, they are worth choosing, so they have value. All right, that sounds kind of complicated maybe. We'll get to a description of this in a moment. But what he's saying here, what makes the Stoics different from some of the other schools is, first of all, they do think that virtue is the one true good. That makes them more aligned with the Cynics, okay? But what separates them from the Cynics is this idea that some things are worth choosing. And as he said earlier, without that, he doesn't think virtue has a purpose. The purpose of learning virtue, of learning self-control, learning to be wise and temperate and all of that, is so you can make clear choices when it comes to the things that are outside your sphere of direct control. We can't just shut ourselves in a room. We're living in a real world here. We have to engage in that world, but we need to do so in such a way that we maintain our virtue. And we can't do that if we don't make choices and if we don't have the tool set to make good choices. Stoicism is all about choice. It's how to make choices that don't disturb your own character. Yet it must not be inferred that the attainment of these choices is the ultimate good, insomuch as moral action is not one of the primary natural attractions, but is an outgrowth of these, a later development. And as I have said, at the same time, moral action is in accordance with nature and stimulates our desire far more strongly than all the objects that attracted us earlier. So as we grow and as we learn and as we study virtue and things, we start to really want to pursue moral actions, something that we could not have done earlier, but is an outgrowth of our knowledge of virtue and of philosophy. But at this point, a caution is necessary at the outset. It would be an error to infer that this view implies two ultimate goods. Okay, so we have to be careful to remember the pursuit of indifference, these things that are outside of control that don't really affect our virtue, but they are things that we have to deal with because we live in a real world. We don't just live in a thought bubble where we just sit in our heads all day. We have to engage in the world. Now, that outside world has no goods to offer you. There is no good outside of your own mind. So what he's saying here is don't confuse this act of choice and pursuing things that have value. Remember, value is different than good. Okay? Value is what you apply to things outside yourself, but good is only available within. So don't think there are two kinds of ultimate goods. And then he goes into a very famous example here. For though if a man were to make it his purpose to take true aim with a spear or arrow at some mark, his ultimate end corresponding to that ultimate good, as we pronounce it, would be to do all he could to aim straight. The man in this illustration would have to do everything to aim straight, and yet, although he did everything to attain his purpose, his ultimate end, so to speak, would be what corresponded to what we would call the chief good in the conduct of life, whereas the actual hitting of the mark would be, in our phrase, to be chosen, but not desired. All right, so once again, all of these things are wordy. We should rewrite these to fit modern English, perhaps, at least American English, which was what I speak. But what is he saying here? So to put things into perspective again, how do we make sense of all this Stoic jargon and everything? Well, think of it like someone throwing a spear. I like to throw spears. I have an atlatl. If you don't know what an atlatl is or an atlatl, Google it, ATL. It is a ancient lever that allows you to throw a spear. I have kind of a rudimentary one made of a dowel rod and a couple of arrows, and I occasionally take them out back and throw them at targets. So I understand this. I'm not good at it, but I understand that concept. And also with archery, someone shooting an arrow. Okay, so let's say you are an atlatl, competitive atlatl thrower. You have practiced throwing spears at a target over and over again. You've refined your technique. You've studied your technique. You've looked at others. You have improved. You've done everything you can to learn this craft. And now the day of the big competition. And there you are in front of the crowd, blah, 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 about to throw your atlatl spear at a target. What is in your power here? What is the good? The good is that you've done everything you can to hit that target. You weren't careless. You got enough sleep, as much as you could get. That's another kind of external, right? But you've done all you can to hit that target. You're not careless. You practiced, and now you're attempting to do exactly as you've practiced. That's all you have complete power over. You throw that spear, and now it's heading towards the target. Okay, a couple things could happen here. Boom, hits the target right where you aimed. Boom, awesome. You have done exactly what you want. That arrow hitting the bullseye is what you hoped for. It's what was desired. But you can't choose it. You can't make it happen. It's not in your power. You can do everything you can to set up every likelihood that it will hit that bullseye, but you can't absolutely guarantee success. So it's desired, but you can't directly choose it like you could if you walked up and just stabbed that arrow into the target, right? You're throwing it, the arrow could snap and break. Perhaps you have an uncontrolled muscle twitch and the arrow moves slightly to the left. The wind picks up. A number of things could happen that cause you to miss the target. Those are all things not in your direct control, and therefore our true good is not affected by whether or not we hit the target, but whether or not we gave it our all. All right. Now, probably not too many spear throwers out there in the audience, I'm afraid, but you can apply this to any aspect in life, every activity in life, being a parent, driving to work, working on a project, mowing your grass. You do everything you can in the most virtuous way possible, knowing that you have a reserve clause. You've done all in your power, so fate permitting, you'll accomplish that desired end. But that's not a good end. It's simply a desired end. Let me correct something before we end the show. I've kind of misused the language here. They say that to hit the target is to be chosen but not desired. That means you've done all in your power. You're choosing to try to hit the target, but you're not going to desire it, meaning you're not going to be worse off if you miss. Desire has a specific meaning in Stoicism where you're tying your success into your well-being, and that's not the case when throwing the spear. And on that note, I will point out, by the way, if you have not picked up the new book by Massimo on Stoic practices, I'll give a better plug for it at the end of the podcast here. But this week's reading was on, and practices were on, trying not to use the word good or evil outside of the context of internal choices. It fits right in with the theme of this week's show. But they have a Facebook group. If you have that book and you're trying to follow it, and you would like a community to go along with that, so check that out. Also, I want to thank Jed for joining as a patron. He's a longtime follower of the show. Thank you, Jed, for doing that. I have several patrons that make this show possible because, quite frankly, it gets expensive hosting the podcast and dealing with a website and all that kind of stuff. I wouldn't have it if it weren't for patrons helping me to support it, because it's a couple $100 a year. I'm not going to tell my kid we can't go to the zoo because I have a website for a podcast about a 2,000-year-old philosophy. That's just not how I'm going to roll. But they make it possible. They make it possible for me to pay. If it weren't for my patrons, there would only be about 20 episodes available probably on the podcast, because I would have to delete old ones to make room for new ones. But because I have patrons supporting the show, I can keep the old episodes online. They make it possible. Like PBS says here in the States, by viewers like you. My rewards include occasional extra content, and I've offered live chats. There's a Facebook group for patrons that they can interact with each other on. I'm also on Discord. Actually, even if you're not a patron, you can sign up on Discord. I'll put a link to it in the show description, how to join my Discord group. And I am working on, because as you may have noticed, I guess I haven't really announced this, I went ahead and had a logo designed for the show. I know I like the old logo too. Some people like the old one better probably, but change is always hard. But the old logo is based, or the new logo is based on the old logo. It's has the look of a Roman coin with the Sunday Stoic written in the margins of the coin. And what I am going to do, I have to figure out the details yet, but I'm working on having a kind of like a challenge coin made that will have the logo on one side, and rather than the Sunday Stoic printed on the coin, it will say Carpe Diem, kind of my slogan, which is not exactly a Stoic phrase, but it goes along with Stoicism. Seize the day, do what you can when you can, right? And on the backside, I'm going to have a quote from Epictetus, persist and resist, which is kind of a motto, persist in doing the right thing and resist all the other things that don't matter. And then around the outer edge of the back, it'll say, there are some things in our power and others that are not. And it'll be a nice handy thing that you could carry in your pocket or put on your shelf or whatever. And I'm going to make that a reward for patrons at a certain level. I have to figure out the details, but look forward to seeing that probably in late August or September. I may also have a few up for sale to help offset the cost of having them made. So we'll see about that. But the book by Massimo I mentioned earlier, Massimo and Gregory Lopez wrote this book. Gregory and Massimo have both been guests on the show in the past. It's called A Handbook for New Stoics, How to Thrive in a World Out of Your Control. 52 week-by-week lessons. I've been going through it, and some weeks I've been better at sticking to it than others. I won't lie, my habits need improving. Maybe this book will help. But check it out. And they do have a Facebook group if you want a community to help you stick to it. All right, everyone. I think that's all I have for you this week. If you want to support the show, one-time donation, you can shoot it to me through PayPal, SundayStoic@gmail.com. If you want to become a patron and support the show, you can do that via patreon.com/SundayStoic. And one way that you can help the show. How could you help the show? And it doesn't involve any money, because I hate begging for money. I wish I was rich and I wouldn't have to just say, could you help me, please? But here's what you can do if you like the show, but you're not going to throw any money this way. That's fine. I don't begrudge you one bit. But what could you do? You could leave a positive review on whatever platform you use to listen to the show. If nothing else, give it some stars and say, I like it, and hit submit or something. Just because if you get more ratings that way, it bumps you up and it makes more people, it makes it more likely that others will discover the podcast. Okay. You can share it on social media, of course. And of course, those rankings are important. I actually, oddly enough, got an email that the Sunday Stoic was number 60, which is, probably pretty low, but I still thought it was impressive that my dumb self has the 60th ranked podcast in the philosophy category on iTunes. I don't even know if there are 60 podcasts on philosophy on iTunes. I haven't even looked. So anyway, I don't know. It's just funny. But if you could support the show, we could have a few more listeners. And I appreciate you all sticking with me. I know my show is not highly crafted where I read a script or anything. I prefer to think of me as the late night live radio host of Stoicism. And I'm glad that I have some listeners that appreciate the content and the format and the work I do put into this. I appreciate that. So have a great week, and I will talk to you soon. Carpe diem.
Thank you for listening to The Sunday Stoic. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review The Sunday Stoic on iTunes. Become a member of the Sunday Stoic team, earn rewards, and be an integral part of the show by becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/SundayStoic. Contact the show by emailing sundaystoic@gmail.com or by leaving a voicemail at 501-503-3132. To find out more, visit www.sundaystoicpodcast.com.